Somewhere in the hills of eastern I Corps, a 6-man reconnaissance team went aground beside a wood line and waited to die. An NVA counter-reconnaissance platoon had cut their trail at the landing zone, followed them along the trees, and sent a second element ahead to lay an ambush across their path. What saved most of them was luck. They stopped a few meters short of the kill zone, which forced the North Vietnamese to come after them in the open instead. Every part of that engagement had been designed. The unit that ran the team down existed for one purpose: to find small American reconnaissance teams and destroy them before they could do their work. By the end of the war, there were units like it across South Vietnam, built by men who had studied the American reconnaissance team the way a mechanic studies an engine, looking for the one part that could be made to fail. American commanders who had spent months chasing local guerrillas now faced organized formations that would meet a battalion head-on, and to fight those formations, a commander first had to find them. Finding them meant seeing past the range of his own artillery, into country where a large unit could not move without announcing itself for miles. The answer was a kind of soldier the army had barely begun to field. 4 to 6 men, inserted on foot, deep inside ground the enemy administered, watching and reporting, and, on a good mission, never firing a shot. Their value rested on a single condition: they could not be found. A hidden team could report the movement of a whole regiment and bring artillery and airstrikes down on it before the enemy knew he had been seen. That was the entire proposition, and like the airmobile proposition being tested elsewhere in Vietnam that same year, it depended on one thing working and kept working only as long as that thing held. The concept was not improvised in the field. It was built by the Special Forces, and specifically by the unit designated B-52, better known as Project Delta, based at NHA Trang. Delta started in May 1964 as an outgrowth of an earlier program called Leaping Lena, and it grew from a single 12-man detachment into a battalion-sized command of nearly 100 Special Forces soldiers and more than 1,200 indigenous troops. Its teams, usually 2 Americans paired with 2 indigenous personnel, went into territory conventional units could not reach. They located enemy formations, called in air and artillery, assessed bomb damage, and now and then raided. In 1965, the unit was run by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Beckwith, a name that would carry weight in the special operations world for decades afterward. Delta worked well enough that General William Westmoreland took the lesson and generalized it. He authorized reconnaissance elements for the conventional divisions arriving in country, and he ordered the 5th Special Forces Group to build a permanent school around the methods Delta had developed. He called it Recondo, from reconnaissance, commando, and doughboy, and the school at NHA Trang set the standards and procedures for nearly every American long-range patrol unit that followed. A covert experiment had become doctrine, and it became doctrine because the intelligence these teams produced was worth the trouble of producing it. In the first years, the trouble was almost entirely one-sided. The North Vietnamese had come south to fight American divisions, not to chase individual teams, and they had built no dedicated answer to the men slipping into their base areas. Consider the patrol's Staff Sergeant Brooke Bell took out just before Christmas of 1965, into the mountains along the coast north of Vung Tau. 4 men: Sergeant Charles MacDonald on point, a Chinese Nung named Quan, First Lieutenant Ko Holland. They were told to prepare for a 2-day patrol and were handed almost nothing by the division that owned the area, which is itself the tell. The infantry commands did not yet understand what these teams could do or what they needed. The helicopter that carried them in made its own errors, drifting too close to a village and faking an insertion into the wrong clearing before finally dropping the team in deep shadow as the sun went down. Bell's team found the enemy and shot its way clear, which happened often enough in those years. But the firefight is not the point. The point is that in 1965 and into 1966, the enemy had no system for detecting and destroying these teams. A lurk patrol that avoided obvious mistakes could work in the enemy's backyard with a latitude that would later seem impossible. It could watch a trail for days, call in strikes, and disappear. The North Vietnamese knew in general terms that Americans were prowling their areas. They had not yet organized to make that prowling fatal. That freedom rested partly on the ground itself, which favored the concealed observer. The country the teams patrolled was among the hardest in the world for the purpose. Triple canopy jungle shut out the sky and cut visibility to a few meters. Elephant grass grew taller than a man. Mountains and ravines funneled movement into predictable routes, and the monsoon grounded aircraft for days while turning the ground to mud. All of it cut both ways. The same terrain that hid a team would, if the team were ever pinned, slow the helicopters coming to save it. In the early period, the enemy had not yet learned to use that second edge, so the teams enjoyed the concealment without paying the full price of the isolation. The discipline the work required was total even then. A team on the ground did not speak above a whisper, if it spoke at all. Hand signals replaced words. Men ate cold because cooking meant smell and smoke, and when they heated water they used small balls of C4, which burned fiercely and gave off no scent. They carried everything out because a single wrapper left behind marked their passage like a signpost. They avoided the easy routes, the trails and stream beds and ridgelines, precisely because a knowledgeable enemy would eventually think to watch them. In the early war, the discipline was insurance against bad luck. Later it became the margin between living and dying. The margin narrowed because the North Vietnamese did what they did with every American advantage. They studied it, found the part that could be made to fail, and built a countermeasure. And the reconnaissance teams were, from the enemy's point of view, an intolerable problem hiding in plain sight. When a base area suddenly drew accurate artillery, or a moving column was hit by air that seemed to know exactly where it was, the cause did not have to be guessed at. Somewhere close, a handful of Americans had been lying still, watching. Removing those watchers became a priority, and the enemy pursued it with the patience he brought to everything. What he built was not a single unit, but a system in layers. At the bottom were ordinary trail watchers, posted near landing zones and trail junctions, and even that simplest layer proved hard to defeat. A local Vietnamese who spotted a team could earn real favor with the district Viet Cong commander by turning it in, which meant a patrol could be compromised by people who never carried a weapon. It got worse when the watchers brought dogs. It was hard enough to slip a trail watcher. It was twice as hard to slip one with a dog that could follow scent through country where the men had left almost nothing to see. Above the watchers were the trackers, men who could read the ground. In dense jungle, a team could not move without leaving traces. A boot print in soft soil, a broken branch, a bent stalk of grass, a discarded scrap. The faint smell of repellent or tobacco on the air. Trackers learned to follow these signs, and once they cut a trail, they did not simply chase it. They worked out the team's size, its direction, how fresh the trail was, then moved to get ahead of it or around it, to make contact on their own terms. The Americans came to speak of these hunters with real weirness, and the name that attached to the worst of them was the tracker team, a hunter-killer element built for one job. Then the enemy went to work on the mechanics of how the Americans arrived and left, because those were the moments a team was most exposed. He watched the helicopter. The false insertion, in which a helicopter touched down at several points to hide which one actually dropped a team, worked only as long as the enemy could not tell the difference, and in heavily used areas he learned to tell. Isolated landing zones in enemy country were watched as a matter of routine. Teams going into such places came to assume they would have to shake trackers immediately, before the sound of the departing helicopter had faded. On one patrol into War Zone C, an overflight confirmed the only usable landing zone sat in heavily used ground, and the men knew at once what that meant. Within minutes of touching down, enemy soldiers appeared, crossing the team's back trail, and a single tracker settled in behind the patrol and stayed there. The enemy prepared the ground itself. Teams began finding areas where individual trees had been cut to open the forest floor without breaking the canopy overhead, clearing fields of fire while keeping cover from the air. They found fresh machine gun emplacements sighted down the trails, waiting to be manned. They found markings scratched into stumps and trees, a sign system the enemy used to coordinate his own movements. Taken together, it pointed to one conclusion. The North Vietnamese were no longer reacting to the arrival of American teams. They were organizing their base areas on the assumption that teams would come, and building the machinery to deal with them when they did. The most developed piece of that machinery was the dedicated counter-reconnaissance unit, and its method was a trap built around the one thing every American team could not do without: extraction. The team had to be pulled out, which meant it had to reach open ground and stand still long enough for a helicopter to land. The counter-reconnaissance unit did not attack the moment it found a team. It tracked, then herded, applying pressure from one side to push the patrol toward ground the enemy had already chosen and covered. The engagement that opened this account was exactly that method, run correctly, and it very nearly worked. What defeated it was not American countermeasures but chance, 6 men happening to stop a few meters short of the kill zone. By the later years of the war, all of this had accumulated into a different reality, and it changed the character of every mission. A team no longer inserted into an area where it merely had to avoid stumbling into the enemy. It inserted into an area where the enemy was actively looking for it, sometimes with dogs, sometimes with crackers, sometimes with a counter-reconnaissance platoon standing by. The insertion was watched. The obvious landing zones were covered. The trails were marked and the base areas prepared. Every edge the teams had once enjoyed had been studied and, to some degree, answered. The team-designated Tracker 2-2 shows what a mission looked like once that reality had set in. In December 1970, it drew a Recon zone across the Saigon River from Lai Khe, and it went in with the full apparatus of a mature operation. Staff Sergeant Robert Groves led it, with Specialist 4 Rich Vogel on point, and a Kit Carson scout named Ty in the number 3 slot. The team flew out at first light aboard a Huey Slick, trailed by a command and control ship, and escorted by 2 Cobra gunships. Before inserting, the aircraft faked a couple of false landings, then flared over a burned-out rice paddy so that ash and debris blinded the men as they jumped down. They ran 30 meters to the woodline, moved another 15, then went aground in a defensive wheel and lay silent for half an hour, listening, before they accepted that their arrival had gone unseen. Every piece of that insertion was a lesson the war had taught. The false landings were meant to defeat the enemy's habit of watching for the real one. The immediate halt was meant to catch trackers already closing, and the deceptions continued once the team moved. On the first night, the patrol set up a position, ate, then picked up and moved quietly in the dark to a different spot Groves had marked earlier, a tactic meant to fool any scout who had watched them settle in. Moving after dark had saved many a team and many a larger unit, and it had become standard practice precisely because the enemy had grown so good at marking where Americans stopped for the night. On the second day, the team found a high-speed trail 2 meters wide, heavily used, with the same scratched markings on stumps and trees that other patrols had learned to fear. Ordered to parallel the trail and see where it led, the team did so, knowing that flanking a trail in jungle was dangerous work, because it was nearly impossible to move alongside a trail as quietly as the enemy moved down it. The character of these missions is caught in a single reversal that recurs in the accounts. A team would detect trackers behind it and choose, rather than run, to turn and wait, letting the hunters walk into a hasty ambush. When it worked, the men who had been the prey became the hunters for a few seconds, and the enemy who had been closing became the hunted. One team leader watched 3 well-spaced North Vietnamese step out of a tree line with the discipline of trained soldiers, understood that a larger element was probably still back in the trees, and opened fire before they reached the open. 2 of the 3 went down. But the phrase that stayed with the men described their own position an instant later, sprinting for their perimeter with seconds to spare before the rest of the enemy recovered. They had been the hunters. Now they were the hunted again. The roles could invert that fast, and often more than once in the same fight. The teams answered the enemy's methods with methods of their own, and the ingenuity ran both ways. One patrol found itself followed by trail watchers and a dog, and could not simply ambush them without giving away its presence and ruining the mission. So the men improvised. They pried open a canister of CS gas, dusted their back trail with the white powder, and then risked the peril of running a trail to open distance from their pursuers. 100 meters on, they heard the dog behind them choking on a nose full of CS crystals, and the howling that followed left little doubt that their pursuers now numbered one dog fewer. A small victory, and a rare moment of comedy in grim work, but it captures the essential dynamic of the late war. Every technique the enemy developed forced the teams to develop a counter, and every counter the teams developed the enemy eventually learned to anticipate. The strain of working under constant observation shows in the smaller moments as much as the firefights. On one late patrol, a ranger team following a heavily used trail was mortared through much of the night, the rounds walking blindly through the jungle around it while the men hugged the ground and ate dirt. The fire was not accurate. The enemy was probing, working the area on the assumption that a team was in it somewhere, and that assumption alone was enough to keep the rangers pinned and awake until the false dawn. When morning came and the men heard roosters crowing a few hundred meters off, the sound told them exactly how close the enemy's villages and camps were. Then the patrol prepared once more to take up its own role as hunters in country where it was just as surely being hunted. Weigh what the teams achieved against what it cost to achieve it. A single patrol lying still above a trail could account for the destruction of enemy numbers far out of proportion to its size, not by fighting but by watching and calling in fire. That leverage was the entire point, and it was real. But the cost fell on very small numbers of exceptional men in extremely exposed positions. A rifle company that made contact could absorb losses and keep fighting. A six-man team that was overrun ceased to exist. There was no margin in the work, and the men who did it were, by design, among the most capable in their divisions, which meant every loss was that much harder to replace. When the enemy had done his job well, the survival of a compromised team came down to factors outside the team's control. How fast the gunships arrived, whether the weather let them fly, whether an extraction ship could reach usable ground, whether tactical air was on station or had to be scrambled from a distant field. The team's own weapons and its claymores bought time. Only air power and extraction delivered a decision. That last point is the whole finding, and the North Vietnamese arrived at it before the Americans did. The counter-reconnaissance units could not defeat American firepower in a stand-up fight, and they never tried. Their entire method was built around the interval, the gap between the moment a team was compromised and the moment American air power arrived to close the account. Everything they built worked to shorten that gap on their side and widen it on the Americans. They tracked to find the team fast. They herded to control where the fight would happen. They watched the landing zones to turn extraction into ambush. They struck hard and fast to overrun the team before the helicopters came. The clock ran against them the instant aircraft appeared overhead, and they knew it, which is why the hunts were quick and violent rather than patient. It is the same logic an NVA regiment used against an air-mobile division on a morning when the clouds were too low to fly. Stay close, move fast, and finish the business in the minutes before the Americans can switch their advantage back on. There is a harder truth folded into these accounts, and it has nothing to do with the enemy's cleverness. The men who ran these missions were often failed by their own chain of command. The reconnaissance units were, in one veteran's phrase, the red-haired stepchildren of their parent organizations, commanded by junior officers and led in the field by sergeants, yet always working for some higher command that understood neither what the teams could do nor what they required. Again and again, staff officers who knew little about long-range patrolling overrode the judgment of the men handling the teams, or diverted a team's promised support to something deemed more important, so that a compromised patrol discovered in its worst moment that the help it had been assigned was not coming. The most common reason a reconnaissance mission ended in combat was not the enemy's skill or the team's mistake. It was a mistake by the people deploying and supporting it. The men who came home carried that knowledge, and it is written into the casualty lists. The contest between the teams and the units built to destroy them was the whole war in miniature. American technology and firepower against North Vietnamese knowledge of the ground and a willingness to absorb the interval before that firepower could be brought to bear. The Americans could win almost any fight once the aircraft arrived. The enemy built his entire method around the minutes before they did. In the large engagements, the American advantage usually held. In the small, isolated, desperate fights between a compromised team and the men hunting it, the outcome hung on an interval measured in minutes, and it did not always fall the American way. The clearest measure of what these teams were worth is not in any body count. It is in the size of the effort the enemy built to kill them. In 1965, the North Vietnamese had no answer to the American reconnaissance team and largely left it alone, and the teams worked with a freedom their successors would never know. By 1970, the same enemy fielded trail watchers with dogs, trackers who could read a day-old trail, sign systems to coordinate a hunt, prepared ground with cleared fields of fire, and dedicated counter-reconnaissance platoons whose only job was to run a patrol down and finish it. No army invests in all of that to defeat a capability it does not fear. The machinery the North Vietnamese assembled to destroy 6 men in the trees is the surest evidence of how much those 6 men, lying still and saying nothing, had come to cost him.